This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
I was going to really talk about the role of media in creating connections and role of diaspora in that. We heard in the earlier, by the first speaker in the session about the Bhojpuri diaspora, but I want to talk in more broader sense about the role of media in creating those connections, and within that looking at not just a particular subculture, but a broader kind of trend of media movement. Now, if we look at histories of major countries in Europe, whether it's France, Germany, Britain, there has been a major, or the US, major movement of population connected with imperial history. So you have a sizable number of some Asians in this country, people from Maghreb in France, Latinos in the United States. And that migration has, as we know, a very long and complicated history. I think what is interesting is the more recent migration. And I think students, what the previous speaker just said, actually is very relevant in terms of this internationalization of higher education, which has meant a different class of migration. An educated group of people traveling across the world. A younger demographic. A group which is also in some ways quite similar in their culture. The youth culture is much more shared than many other cultures around the globe. And you also have a transnationalization taking place in, say, multinational corporations. If you look at any major corporation today, you will find the staff is very multinational. Increasingly, that's also happening to the non-governmental sector, the NGOs, international NGOs. The guy who heads the Greenpeace here in London is somebody from South Africa who has Indian ethnic background. So you have this different kind of movement of population, students, business people, corporates, non-governmental sector, and also the people who are forced to leave their homeland, whether they're seeking a better economic opportunity or they are forced because of war or conflict. So as a result, what you have is a very complicated actionscape. And within that, the role of media becomes very important because you're living in an alien land, and you're going through this what is sometimes called the othering process. You are not one of the majority population. You are the other, and they're all questions of race and ethnicity and all that. So traditionally, it was very hard for these communities to actually keep connections with their original culture. I mean, speaking from my own experience, I've been in this country for 24 years now, and I used to go to Southall in West London to buy a week-old newspaper because there was no internet, there was no satellite TV. And today, with the expansion of the internet and satellite TV and other mechanisms to access information, media itself has become global. And there is a kind of contraflow. Not everything is coming out of New York or London or Paris. There is also increasing visibility of content coming out of Shanghai, Mumbai, Cairo, telenovelas from Brazil and Mexico, Al Jazeera, Arabic television, Arabic news. So it's a very complex world. And I think media actually plays a very, very important role in this. Although in the general discourses about internationalization or globalization, it is not often given the prominence it deserves. But if we think of the internet age in which we are living today, in fact the mobile internet age, and you mentioned the Stanford example about free content. So now we have potential to actually be able to, for example, if you want to find out what was happening in Cairo yesterday, whether Hosni Mubarak had died or not died, you didn't just have to worry about what the BBC was telling you or what the CNN was telling you. 5 minutes on the internet and you can find quite a different range of information from what the Egyptians are saying, or the Russians are saying, what the French are saying, what the Americans are saying, etc. So the point I'm trying to make is that in this globalized, networked, digitized world, we are better connected than ever before in our history. And that creates, and the diaspora, the thing I started with, the movement of population, that is not only happened, but it's actually going to become more pronounced. In the sense that, if you look at the demographic shifts around the world, you heard earlier about where the education growth is going to be mostly in Asia, which is also reflected in terms of economic investment in higher education, for example. So this movement is actually going, to go even bigger. And it's very important for people, especially in the Western world, to be able to understand it not as a burden that these foreign students are coming and so we've got to adapt to their way of thinking, but to actually welcome them and think about, okay, these might be bringing some different perspectives on how to think about the world, how to think about what is called globalization. I mean, it's interesting to look at, for example, China, which, if IMF is to be believed, by 2016, which is just 4 years down the line, on the basis of purchasing power parity, the GDP of China is going to surpass that of the United States. So it's an imperative for us to actually try to understand not just Chinese as a kind of market, but also Chinese culture and Chinese communication, Chinese media, and how do we understand that? I mean, now the Chinese are providing us information actually in English. So it's not, the old argument was, oh, we don't understand Mandarin, so we can't understand what they're thinking. They're providing you information in English. So are the Iranians, so are the French, even French in English, and so are the Russians. So the media world that we're living in is actually very rich, precisely because of the infrastructure that now exists, primarily digital infrastructure, and the growth of particularly new media, social media, I think is going to be very, very important. Just to finish with one final thought, looking ahead. As of end of 2011, about 40% of the Chinese had access to the internet, and 10% of Indians had access to the internet. I mean, people in India, not excluding diaspora, people in India had access. Now just imagine what will happen when 90% of Indians and 100% of Chinese have internet access. which will happen in the next 5 years, the way mobile internet especially is growing in both these countries. So what kind of content will be traveling through electronic superhighways, and in which language? We've been conditioned to think about the internet as an English language, American-led phenomenon. It was. Maybe we're going to an internet too, which may be a Mandarin internet, or a Tamil internet, or a Hindi internet. And I think in that sense, the kind of convergence that's going to happen in all the digitized media is going to be in one particular format, and increasingly coming from not the traditional centers of media production, but elsewhere. I think that's a very exciting point, and in that sense, a new kind of thinking is required to take that on board. And I think universities have a very, very important role in that, and particularly what we heard earlier about internationalization. I think that's absolutely crucial in making these. Okay. So I'll be very brief. I'll stop. There's some reflections, and I'm very happy to take questions. And if you have questions to speakers spoken before me or comments, you're very welcome. Yes, ma'am. Questions?
Maybe could I start discussion? The growth in media in diasporic languages or languages, whether there is any evidence to show that the actual growth is taking place outside the specific countries of origin from which the diasporic communities have come.
Right.
Or is the content production taking place outside actually exceeding, or rather is influencing the other content? Say, for example, the production of media content in UK, for example, how far it is influencing the media content in India. And it's influencing in terms of the market, because say, for example, in movies, because the 10% or 20% of the income is coming from sale outside. So it therefore influences the choice of. I was reading a report about Tamil film industry, where they're saying that the heroines that are being brought in are actually not local ones. They're bringing in more from outside because the market is outside.
Yes.
So they want recognizable heroines who can be a part of that.
Sure.
So in the same way, is it happening in other media as well? How far has the diasporic media influenced the
I think the most kind of striking example of that is the Hindi film industry, Bollywood, where you have an increasing tendency to privilege diasporic themes. So the hero or heroine has some connection with London or some west of the US, mostly London. London has a particular resonance in India, and because it sort of translates into, if you think about the currency difference. So if you sell one ticket in London, that's like selling 70 tickets in India. So it makes, isn't it? Pound is 70 rupees. So it makes sense for filmmakers to privilege those themes, so those interest the diaspora. And so that's interest to diaspora, but I think they are going beyond that. I mean, I had in my presentation lots of things to show, but I didn't sort of get around to showing that, which is this kind of, they're going outside the kind of constituency of South Asians. So, for example, last year there was a film called Zindagi Na Milegi Dobara, You Only Live Once, and that film was shot to a large extent in Spain. And the Spanish government had actually paid them some money because it's actually great PR for Spanish tourism industry. And the film has a particular a song, which is half in Spanish and half in English. Sorry, half in Hindi. So they're going beyond this kind of South Asian diasporic market. So what about Spain? Because if you get to Spain, then potentially you also can go to Latin America. In relation to the kind of production here, like diasporic production of media, we have again a well-established tradition of Tamil, not so many Tamil, but actually Punjabi, Gujarati, certainly two major language publications, but also more recent Tamil. You have news channels based here, but they do exist. You have very good presence on radio, some language television. But I'm not sure how much they actually influence content back home, because it's a very domestic, very British focus. But it's more that the content from there is now being sort of shaped by the diasporic audience. And diasporic audience is really primarily looking at the US and UK. They're not so much interested in Indians living in other parts of the world. The diaspora, South Asian diaspora is 25 million plus. But they focus on the kind of privileged parts of that diaspora, which really is North Europe and US.
Another question related to that is, do you feel some particular forms becoming more dominant because of the diasporic content, in terms of films as one way, but other creative writing, things like literature, architecture, sculpture, some of the second generation, third generation artists in the UK are producing something quite interesting in terms of music, in terms of and how does it sort of how does a contra flow take place? It's easy to see how the other way around. But material produced in the UK, for example, is it likely to influence?
Well, in terms of literature, of course, that influence you can see, British-based writers, authors, artists, Bhangra artists, for example, Apache Indian, big phenomena in India also. But I still think it is, you see, because the Indian, as far as I can read it, the Indian sort of focus is, it's really moving more to the US rather than the UK. And the US diaspora is so huge and so diverse in the sense that, a lot of them are actually not interested in this kind of stuff. They are really earning a lot of money and working for corporations. But then there are other ways of kind of expressing their identity. For example, we see the whole wedding stuff in US diaspora communities. That's huge. The whole industry around Bollywoodized wedding, for example. And I think the other area where this is, I was talking earlier about this kind of demographic shifts and movements, where this is to be seen is also in relation to kind of, creative industries. I mean, if you think of new media industries, for example, if you think about in the US context, Google, organizations like that, Microsoft, you see a lot of South Asian presence there. And also people are thinking in terms of using those apps in Telugu or Tamil. That is also happening. And reverse. So in that sense, there is a connection. That professional people working for major corporations in the US, in creative cultural industries, are thinking about how they can use that knowledge and expertise platform is that's already happening, and I think that's going to increase also because of the kind of changing geopolitical situation, in the sense that the changing US-India equation, with greater investment on both sides. That also creates this kind of change.
So first of all, I would like to apologize. I am pretty late. I wanted to actually see your presentation. I had an immense interest in it. And maybe I'm bringing up a point which perhaps you might have actually used in your presentation. I would like you to actually point out more towards how local languages are being played around, or are being contested in blogs or Twitters, new media interactive technologies. Would you actually...
Thank you. I'm glad you asked the question, because I just mentioned it towards the end, but didn't really talk about that. I don't blog, so I don't really, I don't tweet, I don't blog. I just about can manage my emails. But I do sometimes look at comments on, say, a newspaper article, and I see a very interesting language developing there. It's not just that this text language is a shortened version of a sentence, but it's also the kind of defilement of language. The kind of words people use in online conversation, they wouldn't use face-to-face. They wouldn't use in a published article. They'd be edited out. And I'm talking about the elite media here. I'm talking about somebody's ranting, some sort of private blog, but I'm talking about on the page of Times of India, for example. Some of the language which I see there it should be unprinted. They say we moderate this conversation, but actually I don't think they bother with it. And it's also interesting in terms of the language use. It's not just although they're writing in English, but there are lots of other words which come into it. A kind of English, if you like, or Pinglish, or Binglish, or Timlish, whatever it is. It depends on the ethnicity of the person writing. So there might be a Tamil word put in, or Punjabi word put in. And I think a lot of that conversation. I mean, it can be addictive. I've had the occasion sometimes to be part of it. You're not participating in the debate, but you're reading what people are saying. And I do find some of the material objectionable. There's whole public discourse. There's certain things that people say or are left unsaid. Yeah, but you see that mentioned there in all its crudity, and I think that I find a problem, but it's not particularly a problem with the area that we are discussing, or the South Asian thing. It's actually elsewhere happening all over the place. To the extent that there's a very prestigious journal called Foreign Policy, and they have regular blogs, and I read it regularly. I'm on their reviews, and they're talking about something quite serious. Iran's nuclear program, or what's going to happen to Egypt, or how do you deal with the crisis in Spain. And they're responding to some well-known person who's written an article, ex-minister or academic or whatever. But the comments are so crude in a very prestigious journal. And when I was a student, when I used to read it in print, I could never imagine that they would allow that kind of, conversation to be on their website. They would edit it out. So this is the kind of top end, and I think it's something to do with the kind of changing culture of online conversation. And as I say, I'm really not very much part of that, apart from doing my emails. I don't really, and I sometimes read other people's comments, but I don't really. I admire people who can do that. That they can tweet and they can do blogging and they can be part of those discussion groups. And the other point I think worth mentioning is a lot of this discussion is not particularly intelligent. It's very emotional. unemotional, is quite, on your face kind of directness and not particularly considered and refined. So that also puts me off sometimes. There's no point wasting your time reading the reasons for people this out. Because we all are entitled to our opinions. But one good thing is it's given us a platform to express them.
That's also kind of another media scape developing.
Of course.
Another kind of hybrid space.
Absolutely.
Within the larger media scapes, of course.
Yes. And also, I think it's the kind of the generational point is important here. I mean, I'm of a generation we did have blogs when I was growing up. But this generation growing up, which takes it as normal.
Facebook
generation. So for them, it is not particularly odd to, write something which has grammatical errors in it, or apostrophe is in the wrong place, or is factually incorrect. It doesn't matter. So I think that generational point is also important. And again, I was saying earlier about the kind of change in demographics. The growth is in developing country. Half the population of Africa is under the age of 35, right? So it's all going to come from there. And or China, India, I mean India particularly, huge demographic pivot. So I think we get used to it. Not just in English might be just incidental. It might be all in Tamil with an English word thrown in, or Urdu word. So it's native. But it's an interesting kind of area of research in terms of sort of hybridization and what it does to identity and to language. Yes.
I was wondering, as you were talking, whether the massification of education has also contributed to this, what you call the definement of language.
Yeah.
As teachers, we are often shocked by the way that language is used, abused, misused. And we are shocked at students who make spelling mistakes we don't expect them to make, even at university.
Yeah.
Perhaps we find it, sometimes I feel maybe we are a little bit too shocked. That may be, it is because we ourselves, at least in my generation, grew up at a time when education was for a much
elite. Yeah.
A smaller proportion of the people. I don't know. I mean, I'm just wondering as I'm speaking whether the fact that such a much larger proportion of the whole population is now.
But you see, if you think of I grew up in India, and if I had to find an article, academic article to read, I had to go to the library, and I was very privileged to go to the top library university in India. But I had to, go to the library, get that article, and then, it was not easy to get anyway. And then you stand in the queue and get it photocopied, very smudgy picture of the photocopied pages, and then you read it. You spent 2 hours getting that, so you read it carefully. Today you go on the Google Scholar and you can find it, right? You don't have to type it, it's all there. So I think in terms of access, it is just extraordinary that youngsters today have access to best of information. And so, although there is this massification of higher education, I would rather say democratization of higher education, and availability of this amazing amount of material. If you think of internet, as a free library at your home, international library at home. Once you have the basic connection, you can access. We heard earlier lectures from Stanford and Harvard and MIT. So I think it's something else. It's not that I think it's the I blame the kind of Facebook, Twitter generation, which is really the way they deal with information is so different from the way people of my generation did. In the sense that they don't have the patience to actually, yeah, they're just surfing, And I think something to do also this hypertextuality of the, internet, that you don't, if you're, I suppose you belong to the same kind of tradition where you there's a linear progression of knowledge. You read a page and you go to the next page and the next page. There's a kind of something in your head, you're thinking about something. And it's a cumulative thing. With the internet, you are reading something interesting and then you click on something else, and you something else and something else, and it's very fragmented. Now, you can work around it, and people do, and you find you look for what you want, and you get it, and you get wonderful information. I mean, I think this is fabulous, the kind of information we can get from so many different sources. So I wouldn't say it is the massification. It's something else. This is a shift in culture. It's not the literate culture that I think you're referring to in terms of elite education. The capacity to write an essay which is based on argument and reflection and defined in language. I think what now is happening often is that, it's a last minute thing and you get this kind of based up and you sort of, it's accessible because information is accessible. So you don't have to worry about, okay, I need to think about what I'm going to say in this essay. I can do it last minute. And I think that's one factor also. You see, even in the UK, it's interesting to note that until the beginning of 1990s, higher education was still, 10% of the population went in higher education. And then again, you have the hierarchy. You have the new universities and old universities. Now the government is saying we want 50% of education, higher education, but I don't think they're going to manage it. It's what, about 40%, 70% now? 35%. So even in a highly developed country with a very long tradition of higher education, half the population, more than half the population, doesn't go to university. Contrast that with Scandinavia, where you have a much higher proportion. Even in the US is high. So I don't think I would actually like to have it democratized further, because now the means exist for people to access information. And it doesn't have to be in a enclosed university office or room. It could be online. And as I was mentioning about the media change, that's communication change, that's fundamental to it. Yes?
We have talked about the availability of this information, how important it is to access to this information, and the impact that this information can have to our generation, the present generation. But what is your opinion on the reliability of this information?
Reliability?
Yes.
Okay. So this is a Wikipedia question, is it?
Sorry?
It's a Wikipedia question. Okay, good. I mean, I say to my students, if I see a reference to Wikipedia, I'm going to penalize it. The master's level essay, you don't want to have a reference to Wikipedia. I think it shows a certain amount of intellectual laziness. So, for example, you want something, you want to write about status of higher education in Britain, just for sake of argument, or internationalisation of higher education in Britain. If you spend 10 minutes on the web, you can actually find first-rate material. You can find material from what the British government is saying about it. There might be a report that they produced. There might be an academic discussion about it. There might be a book about it. There might be an UNESCO report on it. There might be a report from, some other non-governmental organization. And that you can do in 10 minutes. When I was your age, when I was a student, I didn't have that access. So I can't understand why anybody would go and look at Wikipedia and kind of paste, because that's the laziness. And again, as I was saying earlier, the life is such, they're doing so many things that they don't have, I mean, I see that all the time with my students. So I think reliability question is very important, credibility, of the source is very important. But there are ways of checking that. So if you're seeing something on the BBC website, you know, it's very likely that it could have been checked by BBC staff. So for example, yesterday, there were reports that Muslim Mubarak is dead. And I heard it on some radio when I was working, and I checked the BBC website. It was not on the cover, on the front page. Then afterwards, now they put it there saying that there are claims that he's critically ill. Yeah. Some news reports were actually saying he's dead. So BBC has a tradition of doing journalism in a particular way. So that's what I mean about credible source. You know, you could go somewhere else, and because it's now accessible. You might look at a blog and they said, well, actually, the guy is dead and buried. It's just an example. So I think it's not very difficult to find and check, find the right source and check the credibility and authenticity of that source.
But perhaps we have to, I mean, I know that for us that we are all researchers, it's quite easy to know which sources are credible and non-credible, but I have students that it's unbelievable, but they don't know which are credible and not, and they are using it, and you are explaining that how have you used these sources, they don't have any kind of credibility, but perhaps we have to change the way of teaching.
Sure, absolutely, I agree entirely. I think it's very important because there is this danger of information overload. And a generation which is already overloaded with there's so many different toys that they have to. I mean, you know, it's very funny when I've been lecturing for 20 odd years now, and you go to a classroom and you see everybody's got a little machine in front of them, and they are pretending to make notes. And you walk behind them, you see that they're actually chatting to their friends. That this is a boring presentation or something. I don't know, but you know, they're just chatting. The Facebook page is on. So. And one has to live with that. They're used to multi-skilling. They're used to, you know, the mobile is there, and they're also tweeting or whatever. So I think that's what we are starting to do in our university, to tell them in the very first session that, you know, in this particular module, these are a few websites you might like to consult, right? And so they know that you know, there are particular, because they can get lost in that, as you said. And I think it's very important for us to, I think that should be done with all modules, really. That we decide these are the few things that we should consult regularly. But you know, again, you know, it's a matter of personal style also. Some of my colleagues are very keen on this new media technology. So they say, okay, you should tweet while you are attending the lecture. And I've been to events where, you know, it's recently, last year, LSE certification, and this guy was speaking, and there's a screen at the back, full hall, hundreds of people, probably 100 people there, and you could see what they were saying about him. He was tweeting and live, and he couldn't read it, but it's distracting. You know, and you, so I think it's, but some people find it okay. So it depends, you know, but as a pedagogical thing, it's very important how you deal with new technology, how you deal with this kind of multimedia, you know, instant communication. And it's a challenge. But I mean, my worry is really that by spending so much time on these ephemeral things, they do not really get into the meat of it. They don't get into the, you know, point that we're talking about the university. You know, what is the university about? You know. Yes.
I see the BBC are reporting today on the edX consortium of universities that are offering free online courses to anyone in the world. For example, the MITx program, Harvard, and all of this. I wonder, what's your opinion on this? What kind of impact will these free online courses have on the higher education landscape?
Well, as you say, it's already started happening. You know, you mentioned MIT, Stanford is doing it, and I think it will. You know, I'm all for it in the sense that it will actually open up and democratize higher education. And as more and more people get online, as broadband becomes more stable and widely used in developing countries, I think in developing countries particularly, this is a wonderful opportunity, because they can now access content from some of the top universities in the world. And even if they have to pay, like we heard earlier about the University of London program, it's at £4,000 for the whole degree, right? Here they're paying, my son is going to UCL next year, he's going to pay, but this year, in September, they have to pay £9,000 a year. So it's in terms of democratizing higher education, it's wonderful. But they have to think of some model to monetize it. But you just imagine if it is going to 4 billion people, and you're only charging $1. That's a lot. So, potentially it can be a wonderful and democratizing influence in higher education. So I'm all for it. The problem is that universities really haven't worked it out, in the sense that the model is still, one which was developed in Germany in the 19th century. That university has, they make it, they a mortar model. But I think there's certain inevitability about this new technology also, and more communities get online, as their standards of living go higher, as is happening in parts of Asia, certainly China. I think they would be looking for this opportunity, and especially I think it's important in relation to science and technological subjects. I think that's absolutely crucial. So I'm all for it. Okay, so we're nearly over time, and is coffee, please? Yeah. So thank you so much for all your questions and comments. We'll see you. Thank you.
After tea, we'll come back. Thank you.